Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Would AI really write that prompt? Interesting question. Very excited to talk to my guest today. I only have one guest on the podcast, and I am the solo host. Again, I'm Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today from sunny Littauer, which is actually pretty rare. And I'm joined today by Courtney Miller, calling in from one of the best underrated cities on Turtle Island, Pittsburgh. Courtney has previously been on this podcast. When they came on, I think it was episode 140. They were a second-year PhD student focusing on toxicity of open source communities underneath Bogdan Stanislescu, which was really cool. It's great to talk about toxicity, but they then went on to finish their PhD, which took them 5 years and they were at ICSI recently. Very, very excited about their actual thesis, which is about abandonment and open source and what happens when our digital infrastructures are in crisis. I am not the best at the elevator pitch, so I'm going to stop talking and move on to say hello to Courtney Miller. Courtney, it's great to have you on. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. You just finished off this massive thing called a PhD. Can you tell us the title of your topic and what it was about?
The title of my dissertation is Supporting the Sustainable Use of Open Source Software. And what it focuses on is a shift in perspective. So the way that I got into this research is through open source sustainability, which focused on trying to prevent abandonment from happening and ensure ongoing maintenance on digital infrastructure projects. But we realized that, hey, no matter how much we study this, abandonment still happens, and we need to figure out how to support users when they face it. So that's exactly what my dissertation was about. We started by talking to developers, trying to understand the challenges, measuring abandonment at scale, and then developing a tool to help improve the processes used in identifying abandonment.
So every open source project has a natural life cycle. There's the birth of a project, the creation of it. Maybe you get contributors, maybe you don't. Maybe it gets funding, maybe it doesn't. And at some point, it becomes shuttered or dead-listed or removed or closed or archived. What do you mean when you say abandonment?
By abandonment, we mean that the project is no longer maintained. So in the course of the life cycle that you described, it would be the end of it. And sometimes it happens abruptly, sometimes it happens slowly. The problem with abandonment is that the downstream users continue relying on the software and they don't understand or recognize that sometimes, and it can have downstream risks and negative impacts on their software.
So abandonment can happen when a project that's new gets moved on for a new project. So, someone's like, actually, there's a better AI we should use, so I'm switching to this dependency. Or it can happen when a graybeard has decided they're going to stop maintaining a thing for 50 years. In your thesis, did you distinguish between those two types of abandonment, like long-term projects that get abandoned versus short-term ones that get shifted?
We did not make that distinction, but we did focus on widely used abandoned projects because they tend to have a wider user base. But that was the main distinction that we focused on because there's higher risk of serious downstream impact for those types of abandoned projects.
If you're talking about downstream impact, you're talking about the kind of software that has dependencies. What was the data set that you were working with?
When we did the ecosystem-wide analysis of abandonment, we focused on the NPM JavaScript ecosystem.
So that's hundreds of thousands of packages on NPM, which is not an acronym. It's really weird, but it's the Node Package Manager for short, which deals with all of JavaScript, which is probably the world's most popular language, along with Python. Hard to say which one is more. You keep saying this word, we. You were obviously part of a lab, but your thesis was also an independent piece of work. Is there any point to teasing out the two?
In the dissertation, and generally speaking as a practice, when I'm referring to work that I did in collaboration, I use we. When I'm talking about my opinions, like in the discussion section and like higher level abstract of the thesis, like I use I.
Was your thesis a staple job in the sense that you had lots of different papers, which you then put together at the end under some sort of narrative? Or would you say it had a more cohesive thesis to it?
I would say I was fortunate enough to be in a situation where I had a cohesive thesis. I attribute a lot of that to the wonderful guidance of my advisors and my mentors throughout the process. Once we started with realizing, hey, in the first interview study, hey, abandonment is this big issue that people struggle with. They feel like they're winging it every time. This happens all the time. No one knows how to respond. It's super manual to identify. It was kind of obvious that like the next thing we need to do is measure it so that we can understand how to help support and design interventions to help remediate the challenges. So it kind of just presented itself.
So since you had a central thesis and since it sort of combined across the body of work, can you tell me what it was in a bit more detail and what your findings were?
Absolutely. So just in chronological order, in the first chapter of the 3, that was We Feel Like We're Winging It. And that was a study where we spoke to open source maintainers of GitHub projects that relied on abandoned packages. And so we asked them about their concrete past experiences with it. And we identified several points in the dependency usage lifecycle where they experienced challenges. And through that study, we learned that a lot of times developers, as I kind of previously mentioned, struggle with identifying abandonment because often they use manual processes, because although there are wonderful software component analysis tools for other dependency management practices like updates and vulnerability patches, most widely used SCA tools today don't actually help with abandonment. There are some tools in beta, but people didn't really have tooling support. They struggled with figuring out how to respond and figure out what are suitable alternatives. And so we kind of just unearthed all of these different challenges that people have with abandonment. And then we're like, oh my gosh, okay, so we need to help them somehow. But the problem is, in order to figure out how to help them, we had to kind of understand like the scale of the problem we were working with and kind of more of like the nature of it. And so for that, in the second chapter, we did an ecosystem-wide analysis of package abandonment, specifically widely used packages, which we defined as packages that had at least 10,000 downloads in at least 1 month during our 6-year observation window, which spanned from January of 2015 to December of 2020. And in that analysis, we started by first defining abandonment, because as you mentioned earlier, there are lots of different types of abandonment. And actually, there is no right answer to how to define abandonment. There is no one definition. So we did a bunch of iterative heuristic design to come up with 2. And the 2 that we came up with were based on previous literature and our empirical findings. And it is first, explicit notice abandonment, which is where the maintainers of a package publicly express their intent to no longer do so. So for example, that can be a note at the top of the README. That can be flagging the packages archived in the NPM registry, things like that. The other type of abandonment we identified was called activity-based abandonment. This is commonly used as a way of identifying abandonment in open source sustainability literature, including some of my own previous work. And that's where we notice clear shift in activity patterns in a project from regular maintenance to an extended period of inactivity. And so we started by creating these definitions of abandonment. And then we looked at all the packages in the NPM ecosystem that were widely used at the time of our analysis. And we identified which of them were abandoned using our heuristics. We collected a bunch of trace data and we analyzed it to figure out which of these are abandoned. And we identified that out of the widely used packages, about 15% of them had experienced abandonment during our observation window, which was a surprisingly high percentage for me personally. And so once we did that, we wanted to understand, okay, great, abandonment is widely faced, but by who and what do they do about it? So then what we did after that was we looked at what do the downstream users, first off, how many of them are there? We did some estimating. And then we wanted to look at also how often do they respond? What factors impact their responses? So we could try to figure out how can we actually help. So then we wanted to understand how do downstream users respond and how widely impacted are they? And we learned that most exposed downstream users don't respond to abandonment. However, downstream response is significantly more likely when package maintainers explicitly announce that they're no longer going to maintain the package. So when packages are explicitly abandoned, it helps support downstream responses, which was a really, really big indicator. And that actually helped motivate the intervention design that we created in the third and final chapter, which we called Designing Abandabot. And the pun was fully intended. So what we did in designing Abandabot is we knew that people struggled with identifying abandonment because it's a lot of a manual process. So we said, we're going to automate the process of identifying abandonment. But then there was this catch-22, where from a lot of our conversations with developers, we learned that for a lot of them, they don't actually care about the abandonment of all their dependencies equally. So if we just did something like Dependabot does by default, where we notify them of all updates, this would very likely create a lot of notification fatigue and lead to a lot of the key usability issues that limit the effectiveness of tools like Dependabot. And so what we wanted to do is try to figure out, can we create some sort of intelligent pre-configuration tooling that can predict for a given project which of its dependencies would be impactful and therefore noteworthy to their project if it were abandoned, so that we could then know which ones to notify them of and which ones not. And what we learned is that using a combined theory-driven and LLM-based classifier approach, we were actually able to do a pretty good job at predicting which abandonment you're going to care about and which you're not. And that is, at a high level, the core spirit of my dissertation.
That's a really good description. It actually is succinct because it's a lot of work. It's really hard. I definitely have a few questions. This is great. So abandonment is an interesting perspective because it shifts the focus on the nature of the package being developed and not on the downstream usage. If a package isn't changed for 15 years, but it's working fine as it is, what's the point of saying it's been abandoned if it continues to work fine in a dependency tree? How do you deal with that discrepancy where the downstream usage isn't always the same as the upstream development process?
That is kind of the core of why we designed Abandabot, because it's absolutely true. Like, not all abandonment matters. Like, if left pad is abandoned, who cares? As long as it's not deleted, it's not a problem. So the kind of real distinction there is that we don't want to notify people about all abandonment, which is exactly why we did what we did.
Given that, I like the idea of Abandabot, but wouldn't Dependabot or like some sort of CVE bot actually just be better? Because that'll flag issues that are actually issues, as opposed to saying somewhere down your stack you have an abandoned project, which we've decided is going to matter, but may not actually matter yet.
The ultimate goal is like, I don't want to like actually build out a new enterprise tool called Abandabot. The hope is that this technology would be adopted into an existing SCI tool or, built in collaboration with some sort of tooling people. But you do bring up a really good point, which is that if there were going to ever be an Abandabot, just notifying people of abandonment is like a little bit kind of useless. I mean, like, it's good to be aware, sure, but like developers are aware of a lot of things every single day. Some would argue way too many things. So just making them aware of it is kind of useless. The next step that needs to happen is Abandabot needs to help support automated remediation by providing project-specific blueprints of how people should respond. And this can mean synthesizing things like wisdom of the crowd migration patterns or identifying potential suitable alternatives and creating automated patches and things like this. But I think you do bring up a really good point. And that's actually what we heard again and again from developers when we were trying to talk to them about Abandabot. They were like, no, this is cool. A lot of them were very excited about the concept of intelligent pre-configuration, but they were also really clear that's not necessarily enough because we also need to figure out how to deal with it too.
I'm glad other developers flagged that. That seems like an important point to me. Yeah. Another question I might have is, abandonment comes along with pre-existing standards from anyone who uses the word. So I could view all of NPM as being abandoned because none of the packages are getting $2 million a year to support themselves. All of them are under-resourced, to borrow Mako's words from Seattle, right? So what happens when you tag a repo as abandoned when really those people just haven't been resourced well to be able to do their work?
Abandonment is an issue, but there's also this like whole gray space before abandonment, which is where, under-resourced projects lived and under-maintained projects live. And that is a serious, supply chain security threat vector as well. It's not just fully abandoned packages. And so I think that you do bring up a really good point. And I think that, I've seen some exciting work looking at exploring under-maintained packages and how to better support them. I think something similar to Abandabot could be done for under-maintained packages, design a heuristic to identify under-maintained projects. That would be a fun one. And then automate it at scale and identify, especially using dependency tree kind of stuff, you could identify which under-maintained packages are in stress points that would have high impact on the community and things like that. So I think you're absolutely going down the right trail. And I think that it's a very wide, complicated issue. And there's lots of different things that need to be addressed.
It is a difficult space, and there's a lot of room for improvement and work. Andrew Nesbitt, who is one of the guys behind Ecosystems, which is really great. It's a giant map of all of the world's software repositories, including NPM. has been writing some excellent blogs over the past few months. One of them was called Whale Fall. This came from February, where he points out that Michael Windsor, who is, I believe, another open source maintainer, mentioned that in ecosystems like the ocean, when a whale dies, what happens is that its bones get picked clean by other parts of the ecosystem, and it's actually a good thing at some source, right? Every abandoned project leads to space for other projects to take over. It leads to space for necessary forks to happen, and it leads for people to take the bones of a project and then reconstitute them into a stronger and more resilient and more updated project. A lot of the work that you've been framing has been about abandonment being bad, and we should build a bot to highlight how it's bad and how you should fix it. But I wonder if actually abandonment is, again, just part of the cycle of life, and maybe that's okay for things to be abandoned. And how does your work deal with that interpretation?
First and foremost, I am also obsessed with Andrew's blog. I really like it, and I did also read that one.
It's so good.
And you know what? He's not wrong. And I'm really, really glad you brought this up because, yes, you are absolutely right. My dissertation takes one particular lens, but it's a myopic one, and it's not fully representative of the whole situation. On the exact same coin, there's another side, which is, one thing that we've been thinking about a lot, and something that my advisor, Christian, brought up early in my dissertation is that not necessarily every abandoned project is a bad thing. Sometimes things have to die. Maybe it would make sense to think about where should we be focusing our resources instead of trying to keep more things alive. And so I think that that is a very valid perspective. And one thing that we've been thinking about a lot, and that I am very excited to research as well, is looking at responsible sunsetting. Sometimes it is the right choice for a project to be no longer maintained, but that doesn't mean it has to be a bad thing. And there's things that maintainers of projects can do to make it so that the abandonment is not so bad and that it's easier to respond to from the community. And so I think that there's a really important space there in not just trying to prevent abandonment or deal with abandonment, but to also deal with the other side of the coin, which is figuring out how can we help people who need to stop maintaining projects do so in a way that's going to support the most effective community resilience.
Excellent. I'm going to move on to the question, which I think some audience members may have heard about, which is that you mentioned AI, which is really sad that you had to add AI into your thesis, but also it's an interesting tool that may be useful for doing things at scale. Can you tell me about your approach to including AI, why you had to do it, or if you really enjoyed the process?
So I'll preface by saying I did genuinely enjoy the process, but at the beginning it was funny. LLM-based coding tools became like quasi-usable and widely used right around halfway through the second chapter. And so I proposed my dissertation after I submitted the second chapter around October of 2024. And at that point, I knew that it was important to incorporate this tool somehow. And I really wanted to kind of understand how we could use it to support research. So in my proposal, it just says that I'm going to use LLM somehow. I had no idea how. We figured it out because it actually solved a really, really handy problem. And frankly, we wouldn't have been able to have built Abandabot, especially in the time frame we did without it. And so it was kind of a thing where at the time when we started, we had no idea how to use it, but we figured it out. And the way that we used it at a high level is essentially, so we developed the theoretical understanding of what factors make a package's abandonment impactful to a downstream project. And we identified these 4 factors, which were the depth of integration. So how deeply embedded in the code base is it? The availability of alternatives, external evolutionary pressures, and importance of the functionality being utilized. And so we had these factors and we were like, great. So if we can figure out how to measure these factors and analyze them for a given project, then we can make a prediction about whether we think that this package's abandonment will be impactful or not. And the question just became super cute, but how the heck are you actually going to do that? And we could go with the traditional approach where, right, we start with the same way, developing our theoretical understanding, operationalizing the factors into these metrics, collecting data at scale, training a conventional machine learning model. But that would have taken probably 3 years and would have been extremely difficult, especially because we're talking about nuanced context-specific factors. So what we ended up doing instead is using a RAG-based approach to feeding an LLM specific context information based on our theoretical understanding, as well as a theory-driven structured reasoning prompt that had it do chain of thought reasoning for each of our factors, followed by meta reasoning synthesis step. where it made the ultimate prediction of yes or no, this package's abandonment will be impactful to this project or not. And then we used a combination of static analysis and just good old-fashioned GitHub API data scraping to develop the context that we fed in. And then the LLM followed the task, made the predictions. We did an independent user study to evaluate its effectiveness and found that the majority of the time, downstream users agree with the predictions about whether a given package will be impactful to their specific project or not. So that was kind of how we ended up using LLMs. And without LLMs, that would have been really hard to do.
So that makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad you were able to get it done in time and on point and to now be an AI expert. That's great. There's a second question, which is, doesn't AI lead to abandonment of projects in itself? Because that's the question that everyone is currently asking on the maintainer boards. So how is AI affecting your actual case study of abandonment in general?
It's a really good question. And it was kind of funny because I proposed in early April. And when I was getting my final dissertation document together, I was stapling together these chapters, but it felt like there was something really unfinished and unaddressed in the current context of how Gen AI is impacting open source communities. And so I have a discussion section in my dissertation where I talk a little bit about how I think that it could potentially help make abandonment better. For example, it could help automate package maintenance. It could automate dependency migration when packages are abandoned. Maybe projects never have to die. You can just create a fork and maintain it on your own. And so I think that there's a lot of potential ways that it could help support and especially kind of the user-focused approach to abandonment that's kind of advocated for in my dissertation. We're more empowering users to figure out how they can respond effectively instead of trying to prevent the abandonment from happening. But on the other side of the same coin, there are ways that Gen AI could make abandonment worse. And a lot of those have to do with overwhelming developers with a bunch of AI slop, or in other words, low quality submissions that are Gen AI. And it is a really, really big problem in the community. And a lot of projects are having to resort to things like creating new governance rules, shutting projects to external contributions. And it is a little bit tough because those things, for some, appear to be effective short-term remediation strategies, right, to deal with the flood. But the problem is doing those things can impact the long-term sustainability of these actual projects. And so we're talking about the core digital infrastructure that we all rely on that's already classically strained. That's what my entire dissertation was on pre-Gen AI. And now we have this entire other giant tsunami putting a huge amount of pressure on it. And so it's creating exacerbated situations that are making abandonment a lot more prevalent, a lot more difficult to deal with. I think that we're seeing a lot of developer burnout, and a lot of the different challenges with contributions can kind of make communities less welcoming to newcomers, which is really not good for sustainability because that's kind of how you find new maintainers for a lot of projects. So I'm sorry, I feel like I could literally keep going on and on about this, but yes, I think it's a really big, important problem in the open source sustainability space right now.
You just mentioned that I think that it's making abandonment more prevalent. Is there any chance that you can back that up with a study that shows that? Has that been shown? No. Okay,
No, that is pure speculation and hypothesis.
Looking forward to the next study. That's really cool.
Give me a year.
You mentioned AI slop and attention overwhelm, and we all know since Nadia's book, Working in Public, that attention is the currency of the open source ecosystem, and that when that gets overwhelmed by AI, you end up with all these downstream cascading effects. I want to point back to something you said, which is that maybe projects never have to die, which kind of seems like the Outlander sustainability mode for open source. But there's another reason why AI is really interesting, and it's not low quality PRs or attrition of the maintainer funnel, but it's the problem space becomes infinitely larger. So if a project never has to die, that means it can be adapted and shifted to an infinite amount of future languages and an infinite amount of future usage, which raises an infinite to the infinity power amount of future bugs and or PRs that need to be made, which aren't all low quality. They just adapt to the problem space, right? This is kind of what Persig was getting at in motorcycle maintenance. The idea that there's a million different types of studies that you could do. How do you choose between them? Oh no, I'm going to go check into a psychiatric hospital. So I'm curious whether or not you've addressed that at all in the Gen AI influence on the space in your work. about the space itself becoming larger because of the ability for projects to continue, and therefore abandonment becomes both more pressing and also less pressing.
It's been a really fun thing to be reckoning with, especially as I'm kind of at a point in my career where I'm trying to figure out what do I want to do for the next 5 years. Because I think that there has been way more increased urgency put on abandonment because of those issues, even from a security perspective. Now it's getting even worse with like the new tools like Mythos, but we don't even have to go there. But I think that at a high level, yeah, there's a lot of other really important problems that I've been thinking a lot about. And I think that figuring out what to work on is super hard. And that's why I try my best to be as practitioner driven as possible. I try to ground what I'm doing in what are the actual challenges people are having. And then usually the hard part is staying connected and grounded with practice, which is moving so incredibly quickly these days. But that is the ultimate goal and how I try to ground my work. And that's something that I was taught by my mentors and I have tried to continue to practice.
I'm glad that you mentioned the next 5 years because I feel like we will not get to it all in this podcast. Courtney, you're moving on to GW, which is great. You have a next role lined up. Your PhD thesis is available online at your website, which you can find in the show notes. It's called Supporting the Sustainable Use of Open Source Software, which is why I pinged you immediately when I saw the title. Well done. Good marketing. You got on the podcast again. Is there any final takeaway on abandonment and what we should be doing now? Is there anything you would say to policymakers or new students or whoever you think is the best audience for this work? Closing thoughts?
Yes, I think that abandonment is something that kind of needs to be addressed now. It should be incorporated into SCA tools. Tool makers, I think it's really important for the technology to catch up. It's there. Let's figure it out. Call me. But I think that it's just really important to be addressed right now because there's also a lot of other things that we need to do. And so I think that's what I would say.
Awesome. Let's address it. Thank you so much for coming on. Don't leave yet. At the end of every show, we have Spotlight. It's the part of the show where you highlight other people's projects or things which you think need a bit of light put on them. Traditionally, the host goes first. My Spotlight today is going to be a little known feature on the iPhone. I have an iPhone, and I've been reading Die Suche nach dem Auge der Welt by Robert Jordan, which is the German translation of The Eye of the World, a truly horrible book, which I have now read 10 times. And I figured if I'm going to read it for the 11th time, I might as well read it in a different language. Now, I don't speak fluent German at all. But if it turns out, if you go on an iPhone and you select text in another language, you can click on a translate button, and it'll give you a good enough translation that I find I've been a very, very slow read, but I've been able to read it in German. And it's been really, really fun. And so I'm reading a page or two a day of The Eye of the World. I'm learning all sorts of new German words. And I highly suggest it to anyone who is learning a language. Pick your favorite or your worst favorite fantasy book and just have a good time and just sit there and click translate for every sentence. I don't think this is going to an AI. I sure hope not. But it is very enjoyable and it's a useful process for me and something I discovered only a few months ago. So thank you so much, engineers who made that happen. Courtney, what is your spotlight today?
Can I cheat and do two?
Sure.
Okay, so the first one is my dog, Chanel. She is my 14-year-old toy poodle, and she's the best. So shout out to Chanel. Love you. My second spotlight is actually safe MCP. So as agentic AI starts, pulling more and more dependencies and becoming more autonomous, we need to have a shared vocabulary for what can go wrong. And Safe MCP is the first serious community effort that I've seen that helps build that vocabulary. It's built on the MITRE ATT&CK method, but translated specifically for model context protocol environments, which helps provide a structured approach to actually understanding and mitigating security risks. So I think it's a really cool initiative and process. And I think check it out if you're interested for sure.
Thank you so much. That sounds great. Courtney, thanks again for coming on. Listeners, now that you have listened, there are various things you can do. If you enjoyed this podcast, tell your friends about it. Please let them know. Please share it widely. If you're listening to it on some sort of device, you're probably using a vendor like Apple or Spotify or something else. Please like it. That would be really cool. You can comment about how great it is online. You can go to discourse@sustainoss.org where you can join in conversations about this. We will open up a new topic for this podcast as we do for all podcasts. These are rarely used and could be used more. It's a great way to interface with the guests on this show. You can follow us on Mastodon and LinkedIn and Bluesky. You can go and find the show notes at podcast@sustainoss.org. You can email me at podcast@sustainoss.org or richard@sustainoss.org with any complaints or threats. That would be really, really great. And finally, you can donate. Please go to opencollective.com/sustainoss. This podcast is not free. It has generally been funded by philanthropy, but that is running out. And we would love to have a bit more episodes like this where we talk about sustainability of open source. And if you're interested in AI at all, I would point out that we are having an event that is coming up soon. I believe it is on the 12th of June, but it may be the 11th because my time zones are really bad, where we're going to have an open source forum for 2 or 3 hours. It'll be online. You can go to sustainoss.org to find the link to the Open Collective event. It should be really, really good. These are traditionally awesome events where we talk about things that are really interesting. But the great thing about Sustain is that we're not bought by any of the major players, which means we can have honest conversations about what we think about the things that we're dealing with. So please come and join us at that event. Courtney, thank you so much again for joining. Best of luck in your future role. Congratulations on being a new doctor. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.